Hey crafters, have you ever been midway through your project and then all of a sudden your ink smudges? Have you ever watercolored an image or wanted to cope it color and all of a sudden your stamped image starts to bleed? Or maybe you've ink blended a background, decided to add some white paste or Nuvo drops, and all of a sudden those things aren't white anymore. Now, if any of this sounds familiar to you, you may be beginner to ink pads, or you may just need a refresher course in the different types of ink pads that are out there and which ones you need to use for which type of project. So today, I'm going to be diving into several different types of ink pads and how they work. Now let's talk about dye inks, which are probably the most common inks out there. If you're ever unsure of what type of ink pad you have, check the back of your ink pad, it may tell you. And when you stamp it, what happens is it seeps into your cardstock. So it doesn't sit necessarily directly on the surface. They are very quick drying, and usually after a second or two you can run your finger over it and nothing's going to happen when stamping on regular cardstock. These inks are usually very vibrant as well when you stamp them. Now, when you stamp them, it's important to be stamping these things on normal porous surfaces and paper. So these inks, for example, won't work on glossy cardstock. Have you ever tried grabbing a normal felt tip marker like Crayola markers and then trying to write on plastic? It doesn't work. You always need a permanent marker. These dye inks are made up of a very similar formula to something like Crayola markers. Now what's great about these are water reactive, so if you add water to them later, they will react to water. So if you spritz them with some water, they're going to react. If you decide to smoosh your ink pad into your craft mat or acrylic block, you can pick these up in watercolor. There are lots of uses for dye-based ink pads. When it comes to heat embossing, dye-based inks are a little bit difficult. So if you're going to be trying to stamp an image in a dye-based ink and then emboss it or add embossing powder to it, it needs to be done extremely quickly. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but you need to have your embossing powder open and ready to go so that when you stamp, you pour it immediately on top and it's ready to go. The next ink that we have up here are pigment inks. Now, pigment inks, for me personally, I find them a little bit messy. They're almost like a creamy texture or a paint texture. And so when you stamp pigment inks, what ends up happening and how they differ from dye inks is they actually sit longer on the surface of cardstock. So pigment inks need time to settle in, but also need to be heat set in order to work. So if you've ever stamped with a pigment ink and then you've left it to dry and you've left it overnight and it's still wet, it needs to be heat set. These have a really rich and deep color. What's also cool is they also show up on dark cardstock, unlike dye inks, which won't do much when they're stamped on dark cardstock. So when you're inking up, what I like about pigment inks is that you can really see when you have good coverage on your stamp. As I said, they're almost like a creamy texture. Then you can push lightly on your cardstock and then you'll have a great stamped image. And with pigment inks, don't forget that you can also stamp on fabric. Now what I love about pigment inks is the fact that you can emboss with them. So when I stamp an ink, what I like to do is cover it in clear embossing powder, and then I have an embossing powder for every color of pigment ink that I own. This also helps dry the pigment ink, of course, because you need to melt the embossing powder. So you're applying heat, but you're also giving it a little extra protection with the clear embossing powder. The next type of ink I'm going to talk about are hybrid inks, and it fits perfectly because these inks here are a mixture usually of dye and pigment ink. So they are a hybrid ink. Now hybrid inks are really great in the sense of when you're unsure, generally this is the ink to go for. So a hybrid ink is going to sit both on the surface and seep into the cardstock. They are a little bit more slow drying than die cut inks, but they can dry without heat setting them. Generally, these inks as well are Copic friendly or watercolor friendly as well because they are permanent when they seep into the cardstock. Oxide falls kind of under the category of hybrid inks, except for they have a little bit more of a different property when it comes to water reacting, and they have a whole bunch of different techniques that you can do with them. Now, if you're interested in learning about distress or distress oxide inks, I have a video comparing the two here. Another term you may have heard lately is amalgam ink. These are really crisp inks that again are Copic and watercolor friendly, and they can be used for a variety of projects. They have no bleed and they can be used with colored pencils and Gamsol. So they do fall under the category for me as a hybrid ink. Alcohol inks. Alcohol inks, of course, are made of a solvent and they're alcohol-based. These mean that they're quick drying. If you've ever had a rubbing alcohol put on your skin, you can actually feel it evaporating off of your skin. That's how quick drying it is. Now, alcohol inks are meant to be used on glossy paper. You can use them also on metals, and they can be used on non-porous surfaces. Now, alcohol inks, of course, don't come in an ink pad, they come in liquid form. Now, don't forget to be using them in a well-ventilated area or outside or near an open window because they do smell. Alcohol inks have become all the rage recently, and if you're interested in learning a whole bunch of different techniques that you can do with alcohol images or how you can stamp with alcohol inks in sort of a different way, then be sure to check out these videos here. Now, moving into archival inks, these are acid-free and they're permanent when they are dry. You can stamp these onto glossy surfaces, onto regular cardstock, and once they're dry, they are permanent and stay there forever. So what I like about archival inks, for example, is if I'm creating a blended background, I can stamp first, and then if I want to add water afterwards, as long as they're dry, it's not going to affect the image at all. Archival inks are also perfect for watercolor in that sense, so when they are dry and they are permanent. So you can use your watercolors with archival inks. Now, archival inks can also be used on fabric, but don't forget to heat set it with an iron when you're done. Archival inks can be quite difficult to clean off of stamps with regular stamp cleaner or with water. So be sure that if you're going to be using archival ink that you invest in an archival cleaner. Now, there are also solvent inks. The most common probably out there is stazon. Now, I think a lot of crafters have invested in a stazon ink in the past because hybrid inks weren't available before. Now, inks have come a long way in the sense that you needed so many different types of ink pads in order to get the job done. Hybrid inks have pretty much taken that whole factor out. But stazon ink, of course, is still on the market. This is a solvent-based ink, and don't forget you need to keep this plastic piece on top of the ink pad in order to keep it fresh. This is another type of ink that you can stamp on plastics and metals, acetate and vellum, anything non-porous. It will also work on normal cardstock as well. Now, personally, I'm not a big fan of stazon. Because it is solvent-based, I don't know over time how it's going to react with my clear stamps, so I really tried to clean my stamps thoroughly after using stazon ink. Another thing is it generally stains, and you need a stazon-specific cleaner in order to get it off your inks. So for me, this isn't the most logical thing to buy anymore because hybrid inks have taken away a lot of that. But I still do find it useful, along with archival inks, to stamp on things like vellum and acetate. And then there's also embossing ink, which is a very specific type of ink. Now, embossing ink is like a watermark ink, so you can actually stamp embossing ink onto cardstock, and you can go ahead and get an image. So you get a tone-on-tone look a lot of the time when you're stamping in embossing ink. It is a very slow drying ink, which means that it stays a little bit sticky and allows you time to pour embossing powder over top of it. Then when you heat it up and melt the embossing powder stays on the stamped image that you made. Now, if you're curious of learning more on how to do techniques with different inks that I've shown in today's video, you are welcome to check out these video tutorials. I also have the links listed below in the video description. Speaking of techniques that you can do with inks, in my upcoming video, I am going to be comparing blending tools to get the best blend when you're using your ink pads. So be sure to check that out next week. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and have a wonderful week.